Hi there. Good morning, afternoon, evening, everybody. We're here today with the great Alan Meyerson. We're,
Hello.
we're very thankful
Welcome
that
from sunny California.
nice. Very grateful that you can make some time to talk to us today. So
My pleasure.
thank you for that. And yeah, so there are already some people logging in. So feel free to ask any questions you have for Alan, and we'll be talking with him. And then whenever there is time, we'll uh, uh, snudge in a question or two. But Alan, we were just discussing before we went live about your brief history with Belgium, considering, well, the two of us, Jeroen and I, are from Belgium. Thought it might be interesting if you could give a quick, like the audience, a quick
Sure.
introduction of how
Sure.
you found Belgium.
My journey towards the world of being an independent mixer started in Belgium. I was before that. I started actually at the studio, the sound studio at my college at the time, Brooklyn College, and I met this piano tuner who got me helped me get a job at this commercial recording studio in Manhattan called Counterpoint. That was in 1977 or 1978, and um, and when I was there, uh, I was good. I started out. It was we had an assistant who was quote unquote a trained assistant, and I started out as the guy sweeping the floor, and making the coffee and cleaning the toilets and setting up the studio. But it became pretty clear almost instantly to the engineer there and that the guy who was supposed to know what he was doing didn't quite know what he was doing, and it looked like I sort of had a good sense of what was happening. So I graduated pretty quickly to being the main assistant, and so I was there doing that, doing TV commercials mostly, radio commercials, stuff like that. No records or anything yet. And then it was the summer of I guess 1977 or 78, and we got an outside booking from this Belgian producer for this dance record, and no one would do the session. So I literally just raised both my hands and said, "I'll do the session." And they're like, "Okay, we don't, we're not sure what you know, but why not go do the session?" And I just sort of faked my way through it, did the best I could, and it worked out okay. And the guy liked me a lot, and he said to me, "Listen, I have this studio in Waterloo, Belgium, called Studio Cati. It's a beautiful studio with an MCI console. Would you like to work there?" So I said, sure, why not? The money was ridiculous. It was small, and I talked to my parents about it. I was still pretty young, and actually, I think my dad actually came to meet the guy. I'm not quite sure I remember that right, but I think he did. And lo and behold, I end up in this studio. I go there for a little test period, a training period, and I meet their chief engineer, and I go there, and they didn't really want me as an assistant, although I ended up doing some of that too. But I started engineering, and I got the job, and I came back, and it was just a very strange situation. I ended up working. Al Schmidt tells this great story about when he had this demo session to do, and the elevator opens, and Duke Ellington walks in, right? And he's like, "I don't know what I'm doing. You should not be doing this with me." And Duke said to him, "Everything's going to be all right." This is my Al Schmidt Duke Ellington story. They tell me, "Hey, we have a jazz band coming in. It's a 5-piece jazz band. Can you record jazz?" And of course, the only answer I had was yes. So I set up for my version of what a 5-piece jazz band looks like. And they walk in, and in walks this amazing, world class, famous trumpet player named Chet Baker. And I end up recording and mixing this record for Chet Baker at 19 years old, really not knowing anything what I was doing. But it was a great opportunity to sort of make my mistakes, put out a piece of product that like went out into the world, and just learn what it was like to be in the world. It didn't the story didn't end great. I crashed a couple of cars. I trashed an apartment. I was young. I was not smart. I found an American bar where they sold a lot of weed, and ended up smoking my way out of a job, and ended up back in New York, back at that old Jingle studio. Got fired from that and got another job, and then I ended up at the Hit Factory. So so in a funny way, the way these stories work, all of these mistakes, as everything else that happens, becomes part of where you end up. And so Belgium is a huge part of my story today.
That's awesome. And can you talk a bit about how you went from that and the Hit Factory and recording bands to like your scoring career and
Sure.
yeah,
Yeah. So
orchestral.
so when I got to the so the Hit Factory was one point in the career I had met an engineer. I was freelance assisting on a Kiss album for this amazing engineer named Leanne Unger, who teaches at Berklee School of Music now, which is why I teach at Berklee School of Music. And through that, I met this engineer, and I got a job at the Hit Factory in 1979. And I started out again in the library doing librarian work, and again they saw that I had, a pretty good studio sense, and again I got graduated to sessions pretty quickly. But the cool thing was that I was there during the time that John Lennon was doing his Double Fantasy album, so I ended up getting some quality time hanging out with John Lennon and those people. I didn't work on the record, but I brought the tapes in and everything, and I ended up working on a lot of great records. And I got offered a job by the studio across the street, which used to be owned by Phil Ramone. It was called A&R Recording, and the reason they offered me the job was because I had all that experience doing jingles, and they had a big room, so they were a big, where the studio I was in before was a small jingle studio with good clients. This was the biggest jingle studio in New York, and they saw that I could do that, and they saw that I knew a little bit about albums, so they offered me a job. And I worked there for I think about a year, and I left that job for a lot of personal reasons, and I ended up going freelance at a very young age, and I was working with a lot of outside clients doing mostly jingles. One of those clients was this guy named Richard Scher, who he wasn't really a jingle guy. He had a little jingle company where he would do TV commercials and stuff with his partner, but he was into making dance records. And he worked with this guy in New York named Arthur Baker, and Google him. Anyone that doesn't know who this is, Arthur Baker was the premier dance producer in the early 80s. Now, at this point, I had a lot of my story is based on the fact that in my early years, I had some substance abuse problems and I had some reliability problems. And through the process of dealing with those problems, I took the level of unreliability I had, and I made a decision to use the same amount of energy I spent being unreliable to be reliable. And I became a very, very solid, safe person to work with. You knew that if you hired me, you were going to get exactly what you needed. It was going to get done on time. It was going to get done on budget. I prided myself in taking all of that energy and moving it towards a positive goal. And so this guy, Richard Scher, introduced me to Arthur, and we did this overdub session together, and I did a rough mix, and he loved that rough mix. So he offered me a job, and I basically became the night engineer at his studio called Shakedown Sound. And this is a longer story. I'm going to shorten it a little bit, but and the day engineer was Andy Wallace, who of course went on to do Nirvana and work with Rick Rubin and stuff. So Andy and I ran the studio 24 hours a day. It was just, we were doing records day in and day out. And I started doing like every dance record, working with every dance producer on the planet, Shep Pettibone, Bruce Forrest and everything. And I ended up getting a lot of work from this record label called Tommy Boy Records. There's a reason I'm telling you that part of the story. So the president of Tommy Boy asked me if I was interested in doing a remix for Brian Ferry, so from Roxy Music. So I said, of course. So I got that remix. I did that remix. Brian sent the representative to the session, and jokingly around, I had heard that they were having a hard time finishing the record, and I knew they had mixed it a couple of times. So I said to this guy, Simon, I said, listen, if you guys want to mix it a third time, tell Brian I'd be happy to do it. I was kind of kidding, right? Sure enough, 3 days later, I get the call. Hi, this is Brian Ferry. I love the mix you did. Would you be interested in mixing the album? So I mixed the album for him, and that record was called Bête Noire, and it was a relatively successful record. And but what it did was it put me in the record business. It started me like getting mainstream work, and through that, I got work with New Order, and I got work with a ton of independent labels, and I started doing a really wide variety of stuff. At that point, I decided to move out to LA to try my hand at that. I had a big client in Polygram Records. I had done this record Word Up with this band Cameo, and it was a big hit. And so I moved out to LA, and I was doing all these great artists. I was doing the Commodores, the Bar-Kays, all these people of that era that were doing well, and it was a lot of fun. And then I tried to become a producer, and I struggled with that. Anyway, as the business changed and hip hop became more the thing, I became more and more frustrated with my place in the business. I felt that I wasn't as in tune with the type of music that was being made, and I felt that all the work I was doing was less, it was less than the Chris Lord algae stuff that was happening, and and all of these other things. And I felt like I started feeling like I was trying to copy their stuff instead of doing my stuff. So I got a little frustrated with the business, and I took a little break from the business. And then through a circumstance that isn't worth getting into, I met the people that ran Hans's studio, Hans Zimmer studio, and I knew his engineer at the time, who knew me from New York, as this guy who went from jingles to records and got successful. So he saw me for all the good stuff that happened, and they asked me to come down, and they asked me if I would be available to get involved, and I said, of course. And I got involved, and I met Hans, and we hit it off, and Jay decided he didn't want to engineer anymore. So I started doing it. And, then now I'm 300 movies later, 26 years has gone by. What started out as a 3-month commitment to do one movie has turned into, well, I've done about 100 movies with Hans, and probably another 100 movies with Hans, people that work with Hans, and then another 100 movies with people who, just through the process of becoming an established engineer and mixer and producer, have hired me. So that's the journey. It started out at very, very humble beginnings, and ended up in humble endings, which just means, I feel like I'm a pretty qualified film score mixer and a decent record mixer now.
Awesome. That's a nice story. It's like you never know
Right.
when the opportunity hits, but
Well, that's
you
really
have
the
to take
bottom
it.
line is, you just really never know. That I believe, and I tell this to everyone, just always, first of all, if you're under 25, you still can make a mistake, and don't worry about it. So try your best. And if it doesn't work out, then you go to the next step. And I made all of those mistakes all along the way, every single mistake you could possibly make. And then some I made. So, everything, you can look at everything as experience, and everything can become part of the story. So yeah, it's been quite a journey. It's been a lot. It's been a lot of fun.
Awesome. Yeah, I actually had the privilege of seeing you work in 2013, I believe it was in Belgium, in
Right,
Brussels, Flagey.
right,
And I was really impressed, to be honest. Like when you walked in the room, and the fact that you went to talk to every musician in the orchestra and say
right,
hi, who you were. I'm sure everybody there knew who you were, but still you introduced yourself and
right,
made everybody comfortable, and just the whole atmosphere of the whole session was just so great.
right.
It's like everybody
Well,
had a
I
good
don't do that
time.
for any effect. I don't do that because I know that they're going to like it or anything like that.
Hmm.
I am the people. I worship musicians. When I look at players like that, and when you get to that level, you're like an NBA player to me. You are like the best of the best. The worst player in that room was the best player in his college. And I look at that, and I'm just, I'm constantly amazed at how lucky I am to work with players at that level, which is why I feel like I'm more I'm an orchestral musician. I was a trumpet player. And so I know what it's like to try to be that good, and I also know what it's like to not be that good. So I feel that, like, it's hard for me to compete with the Bob Clearmountain when it comes to working with a band. He's a bass player. He loves that, level of playing. And for me, the thing that turns me on is the excellence, and the ensemble, the orchestral ensemble is just blows my mind. I love it. I do it in LA too. I still walk in every session. I spend time in the studio, and some of the musicians don't. They're like, "Why are you in here? I mean, who's running the show in there?" And I'm like, "The show's fine in there. I need to experience it in the room. I need to hear the balances in the room and get a sense of the depth, and how the brass speaks with the strings and how they're balancing themselves, because it's so easy to get away from those organic balances so fast with microphones, especially when you got a bunch of close mics with like modern recording. And it's so, I think it's important to really keep tuned into what's happening in the room.
That's that's amazing advice. Um, would you mind talking a bit more about like your current workflow? Because I feel like I mean I assume like nowadays, like especially like film sessions are huge. How do you, like, you have your home studio, which well, it's maybe not really a home studio, it's like proper studio, but how do you manage like, yeah, your workflow? There you go. Nice emphasis.
Yes, my sessions get huge, probably more huge than a lot of others. I mean, there were sessions on, some of the Chris Nolan movies on Inception specifically that were, we had a couple of 2,500, 3,000 track sessions. And I have a pretty traditional template that I use, and it gets modified based on what my delivery is my delivery specs are. If it's 5.1, which actually most of the time it's not anymore, except for television, 7.1 or Atmos or some sort of immersive environment like that. So basically, the template just gets changed to accommodate that, but everything I do gets fed through, some sort of combining aux, and I do a little pre-mastering on the aux that actually I've been using the Dyne one in my as part of my pre-master chain now, because it's really gives it that, you can get that loudness out of it, and that you can really get this great low end with it. I just love the low end I'm getting with it. And then from there, when I'm at my studio in Santa Monica, I go to another rig and I print stems in real time. But at home, because I'm only running on one computer, I just commit the stems, and then my assistant can tap into my computer and name everything and deliver them. We've been working on a few projects all, during this whole time. Everything's been postponed, and so we're just about to get back into the saddle with SpongeBob, and then after that I have a Netflix movie, and then after that I'm not quite sure what's after that at this point, but there's 4 or 5 movies lined up. So we don't know at what point I'm going to leave here and go to my uh, back to Santa Monica and start working there. Probably it's going to be some combination of the two. And the way, my orchestral world, because we record so many orchestral passes on some of this stuff, we have, each one orchestral pass goes to its own aux, and that aux is where I do the processing for that particular pass. And like each one of them has their own reverb kind of packages, where usually there's 3 reverbs per orchestral pass. There's 2 reverbs that are somewhat similar but a little bit different. One's a little shorter, one's a little bit longer, and then there's one that's kind of super long for creating tail outs and stuff like that, what I call feathering. And then those all go to their appropriate print stems and get delivered the way they get delivered. And a lot of the architecture for me, a lot of time we spend when we start is building my layouts in my layouts on my S6 or here in S3, which is much different, so that I have, when I go to my strings, I have all my reverb sends available for automation and stuff, so that I can, I try to make it so that I'm not really thinking technically very much. That, like in the old analog world of just having a 24 track recording, you're really just mixing, you're just thinking. So I try very hard to create that sort of mindset for myself. So I'm not thinking about routing. I'm not thinking about anything. I'm just really got music under my fingers and I'm mixing. Now, of course, in my 40 input S6, I can handle 1,000 tracks just by building some intelligent layouts. So I'm sort of using my traditional way of thinking and taking advantage of the modern conveniences of digital technology today. So that's pretty much how I do it. It always comes back down to just the music, the visceral effect of the music. It's never, the answer is never, Ed Sheeran says no one ever danced to a Pultec. It always comes down to, the experience of listening to the music, or how the music, drives a scene in a movie or creates the emotion it needs to create in a film, which is one of the reasons I love film music so much. Is I'm not as good. I don't, I grew up as a male in America listening to pop music. I never knew the lyrics to a single song. I knew the hooks, and then it was just a bunch of words. And I look at guys like Clear Mountain; they know the lyrics to all the songs. They know that stuff. So actually, for me, that lead vocal has always been a battle. Now my lead vocal is dialogue, and that really fits my kind of way I hear music and stuff like that. I guess I've always heard music as sort of a soundtrack, you know. So now I can do that and use that experience in my professional world. That didn't answer your question at all. Just
No, no, it was great. And when you mix the orchestral part, like the music part of a scene, do you listen it always with the vocal with the dialogue in?
yes, yeah. I don't not every pass, but
Right.
so the first thing I do always is the same. I listen with the dialogue, the sound effects, and the reference mix that was in the film. And that's either going to be the mock-up of the piece of music that I'm mixing, or it's going to be a piece of temp music. But I want to see what sort of generated the approval of that piece of music in the scene. So I listen to it. I see what's popping through. Oh, this is what's working. It's the percussion that's driving the scene, or it's the short strings that's driving, or it's the melodic content of whatever it is. It's this solo instrument. I just sort of get under the hood of the emotion of the music, that and how it relates to the scene. And then I turn off the dialogue and effects and I listen to how the stems were delivered to me compared to the mock-up. Because the mock-up is really important in film music, especially because there's been so much time and energy put into getting that piece of music approved in almost any movie. You can't really just start from scratch and do your own thing. You have to sort of represent what was already there, just in a better, wider, cleaner, nicer version, or uglier, darker, pushier, whatever the appropriate set of adjectives is for what you're trying to do. So I ref check a lot. I always do this as my ref check, is I'm muting one thing and turning on another thing. And I go back and forth. I make sure all the parts are there. I make sure nothing's been misprinted. I make sure all the MIDI is fired correctly. And then I start mixing it to my own taste. But I'm always going back to that ref mix. I'm always going back to that mock-up to make sure I'm staying somewhere in the range of it. And then at a certain point, their little stereo mock-up or their little quad mock-up, and I start listening and I go, hey, yeah, it's better. It's wider, it's better. The low end is more defined. The moving part is clearer. I cleared away. I look for what's not necessary. Like some of the times in the mock-up, they have parts that are just, utilitarian parts, and they're either too loud or they're too thick or they need to be EQ'd properly. So I start doing that. And, before you know it, hopefully not too long, it starts making sense. And then once I get to that point, then I start mixing. Then I turn off the mock-up and I just listen to it as a piece of music. And then I turn back on the dialogue and the effects, and I start working with the piece of music for it to do its picture. I'm no longer concerned, unless I'm going to do something drastic, like take something out or massively change a balance. All I'm doing now is getting into the fine tuning and doing what I think is right with it from my point of view. And at that point, that is actually kind of a two-part process. Usually, I do the first part and then I move on to another cue, and then I come back. And the beauty of today's world is there's no recall really per se, so you can just close and open whenever you want. So I go through the movie really quickly, and get all the basic stuff done, and then I go back in with the dialogue and I start mixing it to my taste. And once I'm past that, then I play it for the composer or the director or whoever is the decision maker, and let them hear what I heard and get their comments. Hopefully their comments is fucking great, don't change a thing. Never happens. Everyone always needs to pee on the hydrant, which is, and I don't know if that expression translates. Amy got it.
Yeah,
Everyone
you
needs
did
to
get
pee
it.
on the hydrant.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's like, so they're always going to come up. If you ask them a question, they're going to give you an answer.
Yeah.
So that's sort of the process, and multiply that time. Wash, rinse, repeat. 60 cues in a movie. In like Star Wars Fallen Order, we had 6.5 hours of music, so there were 300 cues. So that's the way it goes. Although in that they didn't really have any changes; they just sort of let me do what I did.
I had a question about the surround and also immersive flow. You partially answered it by, you said there's a stereo reference or mockup that you listen to. At what point do you go into 7.1 mixing? some lag, I believe.
Just lost everyone.
Oh, yeah, you're back.
I
Thank you.
just lost it. Oh, there you are. Okay. You know, you were breaking up when you were asking me that question about the mock-ups. Something about the stereo reference.
Yeah, like the main question is where in this flow do you transfer to, or do you go into 7.1 or immersive workflow? I guess it's
Well, I go into it immediately. You know, usually the composers don't write in true surround. A lot of the composers write in quad because they're dealing with a lot of quad samples. And the truth is that, you know, for them to really, you know, the center channel gets used very little, even in my mixes. You know, the center channel is I only have a few uses for it, and very specific uses for it. And they, you know, their rooms aren't, you know, they don't really use an LFE or a subwoofer. So they're either mixing in stereo or they're mixing in quad. So, but when I get it, I'm immediately thinking about it in surround. Even if I'm mixing a synth generated cue where everything I get is in stereo, I'm figuring out, you know, ways to make it a more immersive experience using whatever technology is appropriate for that. You know, I have like so many different, now there's so many millions of ways to create surround out of stereo, depending on what it is. I'll use one of the different, you know, possibilities. But you know, I'm always thinking, and I sort of start thinking like that, unless specific, like I'm doing a movie that's starting in July where they want it in stereo. We're delivering a stereo score. That's what they want. So that's what's happening. And they want a mono score, to be quite honest with you. So it's going to be predominantly mono, but I'm going to use stereo to sort of help give, you know, using again your plugin, the Stage One, is a very, very elegant plugin for taking mono material and spreading it out in a way that doesn't feel like it's spread out. So I can create a little bit of width and size, and through that, the ability to separate and unmask things using just very subtle creations of stereoizing certain frequency ranges of certain sounds. You don't even have to do the whole sound. I could do everything from 400 up, or I could do everything from, you know what I mean? There's different ways to do that. That plugin is actually great at it, especially with the mono to stereo mode, because I'll tell you where I use that a lot is like if I have two guitars and they're kind of sitting on top of each other, you know, and in the ref mix they're sort of left there. And one of the easiest ways to make something sound better is you can pan them. But the thing is, dry panning left and right just doesn't. First of all, it doesn't really translate theatrically, and even in records, you know, if you know, use a little bit of delay to get to the other side. Well, delay is great, but you're delaying the whole thing. So the low frequencies are getting delayed too, and you end up with frequencies that are canceling out and the combing effect and everything. Well, that plugin, you know, you take the mono, you move it up to stereo, and then you have a panner left and right. So I literally just do that. I'll stereoize it a little bit. I'll pan sound A to the right, and I'll pan sound B to the left a little bit. And now, you know, in a very, very subtle way, which almost until you take it out, you don't even realize it's in. You've created width, you know, and you've created the ability to hear two sounds that might have been competing with one another.
Yeah, that's cool. And Roman, you have a question or?
No, it's okay. Feel free to ask.
Okay. No, well, I'm because I worked. My previous job was in immersive audio, so I did some work there. And one thing that we always got back from post-production was that it's a lot of additional work, like additional workflow tools that have to be used. And do you experience the same? Is it like, does it make the mixing process longer? Is it an extra burden? How is that changing?
It makes the mixing process a little bit longer. It certainly makes the setup process longer. You know, it's another, I'd say another 50% of time to get all your, you know, your stuff set up and aligned properly. And then the thing is that your decision making process increases because you have other options available to you that you didn't have before. Once you get into an immersive world, you know, like on Star Wars, we actually spent the time, because we had the time. We recorded everything using a bunch of different, at Abbey Road, but using a bunch of different immersive miking techniques. And so they gave me free reign to do whatever I wanted. The only thing they asked is, at the end of the day, could I deliver to them an ambisonic mix and a non-ambisonic mix that's just in surround. So So I did. I downloaded the proper software to be able to stick it in the ambisonic shell and do my panning in the ambisonic world and everything like that, create this mix. Took a day off, went back in the next day without that in my head and created the mix in the non-ambisonic world, not just transferred it, because then, you know, your brain is stuck in one place and it's a very difficult transition. And then I gave them the option of comparing the two. And in that sense, they chose the non-ambisonic mix in that sense, because in gameplay, one of the problems with ambisonic encoding of mixes is when you take it out of that binaural ambisonic experience and put it into a flat stereo, the crash down isn't that great. It doesn't sound that great, you know. And they wanted this to be able to translate into any world, and it turned out that the immersive non-ambisonic mix was really great. It just really had a lot of energy and a lot of clarity and a lot of definition and stuff like that. They didn't let me do it. Interestingly enough, we recorded completely ready to mix in Atmos, and at the end of the day, they decided not to put the resources towards Atmos. They wanted to have more resources for gameplay and stuff like that. So we ended up doing a 7-1 mix as our main mix on Fallen Order, and so I brought all the Atmos material down into that. But through some of these immersive techniques, I use them in addition to the traditional orchestral techniques, and it really became quite a sound. I'm very proud of that project. I think that really worked out really nicely. So, but it took time, and it does take time to, you know, Lion King, which was a big project I did in Atmos. I spent a lot of time figuring out how I wanted these sounds to live in the immersive world. And once I got it, it wasn't that hard, you know, but I had to get it. I had to figure it out. I had to see what was, you know, a lot of things that your brain tells you is going to work doesn't actually work. You know, especially in Atmos. So other formats are a little bit different, but Atmos, it's very hard to literally have something sit off the screen, suspended in space. You know, it doesn't really translate like that. So that was, of course, that was their dream that didn't work as much. But what I did find was I could raise things up so that they had the sense that they were starting halfway up in the speaker environment and going towards the ceiling. So that became a big part of the template. Like in the movie The Baddie, Scar, his melody, his motif was all these low woodwinds playing this really kind of lurky low part, all these double bass clarinets and contrabassoons. So I took that which was live with the orchestra, but I took all the mics from that and I raised them up about halfway between the front and halfway between the front height. I was doing the height speakers in quad. So I had it sitting up above there, and that worked very effectively. But some of the other stuff that I tried to do didn't work quite as well. Now, there are people using immersive and Atmos for doing more kind of like effects and stuff. You know, some of the pop mixes that they're coming out with, the guitars are in the back and stuff. That I haven't really resonated with that yet. My thing is more creating this immersive experience where you feel the visceral effect of the sound and you're in it, but you're not like, it's not behind you. It's still sound staged in an appropriate way. It's just a little bit more interesting. My thing is, I'd like you to not realize you're in it until you turn it off, you know? And I'm sure that will change. I'm sure there will be, like, for example, on Gemini Man, which is a movie I did with Ang Lee, where Ang actually came to all the mixes, we got a little more drastic about certain things on that because he wanted that effect. So it's there for the taking. It's just a matter of making those creative decisions, and that does take time.
Yep. All right.
Great.
Yeah.
Great.
Cool, thanks.
I have another question from Sasha. I don't know.
Hi, Sasha.
I'm hearing myself though. He asked about
Sasha being a name that could be a man or a woman.
It's a man. It's a guy. So he's asking about like whether you have had certain situations where, you know, they might like the mock-up more than the recording, or they want you to use a hybrid. How do you deal with certain scenarios where, you know, that might become the case, where they get very used to a mock-up or, you know, something like that?
Yeah, well, you know, that's why it's important not to go too far away from the mock-up. It's like I try to make it so that if they did like the mock-up, they're still getting everything that the mock-up offers, but it's just a slightly better version. But yeah, that happens at times. There was, Chris Nolan was notorious for that, because he once the mock-ups were done, once Hans was done writing, it started getting edited into the mix, and they were actually doing final mix levels even with the mock-up. So by the time we got to orchestral stuff, we were replacing the mock-up, but it was a very tedious process of making sure that what I was replacing matched exactly, not only in balance, but in level, so that I'm delivering something that was exactly the same level with exactly the same balances, just with certain sounds that were replaced. And as Hans will point out, there were certain parts of Interstellar, I think, where they ended up using the mock-ups. So the recordings, if it's going to be a hybrid recording, where you're using sample strings and combining them with live strings, that's sort of a decision that gets made in the beginning of the process. And if I know that that's the goal, then I think along those lines. And usually that takes one or two times of sitting with the composer and getting the general relationship between the live stuff and the samples. Some guys want it to be 80% samples and 20% live. Some guys want it to be 70% live and 30% samples. And until you get a sense of that, it's almost you're guessing. And then the third scenario is where you are, for the most part, replacing with the live stuff, the samples, but there are still certain samples that the live guys can't really play because of the nature of the way samples are programmed. The perfect example that I always use is marcato strings, that the samples of the marcatos tend to be longer than the actual playing of the marcato part would be with the orchestra. So if you completely replace those short string parts with live guys, there's something that gets lost. And so invariably, there are times where I'll blend the two of them together. And, I'll make sure very, carefully that the timing is right. I'll have one of my assistants edit the timing of either, if the short strings are a separate pass, I'll edit the live short strings to match the marcatos or the sampled shorts, or vice versa. If the live shorts are played live with the orchestra, then I'll edit the samples to match it. But so those are the three basic scenarios of the way that works.
Awesome.
But yeah, there are times where it's very hard to fight that ref mix. People do get used to it. There is temp love. I have clients that have been buried in their world of temp love for years. And Pirates of the Caribbean was a project that the director was an amazing music guy. He was a musician and he loved great work, but he really, really got, married to those temps. And I spent a tremendous amount of time matching them, and then adding to the energy.
Awesome. Well, I have a few more questions, but I first have one of my own as well.
Yeah.
I always love when I hear like your mixes in a theater. Like I always feel there's a lot of impact that you create, but also I feel that when you listen to it at home or even through Netflix, that translates. How do you deal with different dynamic ranges that you have in terms of deliverables? Do you make really separate mixes for deliverables for home versus cinema, or how do you make sure that you get the
No,
best?
I don't do that.
Always?
I do separate mixes for the soundtrack, but I don't do separate mixes for home deliverables. Luigi, my dog. Thank you. That's very kind of you to say that my mixes have impact. I spend a lot of time making sure, that my mixes have impact. Processing and time into thinking about to get the percussion to be and well, I think good mixes translate well. I think that's the bottom line. If you're not playing with imaging to the point that you're going to have when it gets crashed down to lower levels of from surround to stereo or from Atmos to surround, if you sure that your imaging is solid going in. I spend a lot of time, my brain hears phase in a very unique and unusual way. When I hear something that is lifting out of the in phase environment, that kind of sends my brain crazy. So if that's the only way that I'm getting width, I put it more in phase and figure out another way to get width. And I think that putting that time in helps things translate down pretty well. But it's just good hard work. It's just finding a few techniques that are working for that project of the thousands available now, with modern technology, sticking with that and just putting the time in. One of the things with live percussion that I do that creates an incredible amount of impact is I align the spot mics with the room. So I take all the spot mics, or I take the room and I shift it forward so that the attack transient on the room is starting at the same time that the attack transient is starting on the spot mics. Because if you're, obviously if your room mics and you're on orchestral stage and your room mics are 40 feet away, then, if you do the math, it's approximately 40 milliseconds later. So in effect, you're having two attack transients happening, and I find that blurs the sound. So if I have separate percussion recordings, I'll always spend the time to do that. And not only that, but if I'm doing percussion live, like at Abbey Road, um, I'll take the percussion mics and I'll move them later to match where the room is, because they're in the back of the room, and I'm able to get away with doing that without blurring any of the other instruments because they're in the back and they're not picking up a lot of the other stuff. And I think that helps create a tremendous amount of impact, because you're not blurring just by the nature of the timing of the microphone rolls. I don't get crazy. I don't line up every mic to. There are times I get crazy, but in the general, I don't have time to do that, and nor do I find there's any great advantage to it. I do a global thing. I take all the spots and I move to the room, or I take all the room and I move them to the spots. It's pretty effective. You should try it. Those of you out there, give that a try if you have a live recording with drums and and it's in a big room, and see how it works. You'd be amazed.
Nice. I have actually a question for Alan.
Yes.
I myself, as well, when I used to work at Galaxy, I work in quite a lot of scores, and with mostly a lot of British engineers. And I moved here to LA roughly 2 years ago. And what would be your experience or take in scoring here in LA versus in Europe? I don't know. For me, it seems that a lot of the mixing, production composing happens in LA. But would you say like recording happens more in Europe? What's that balance, and how do you see that?
No, I think it happens a lot in LA and it happens a lot in Europe, and I think there's a lot to do with budget, and I think it's a lot to do with how the film companies that are doing it, the contracts that they have with, there are times where they have to work in LA. There are times where they can't work in LA. So to me, I'll be quite honest. I think that the best. It all comes down to the musicians, right? It all comes down to the quality of the player. It's great to have great rooms, but if you have bad players or not extraordinary players, no one's a bad player that's getting paid to play. That you never have. But there are players that are the NBA, and then there are players that are great players, but they're not quite the NBA. So, New York, Los Angeles, and London, there's just a level of proficiency that is, still to my ear beyond what I'm going to get if I go into Eastern Europe. Or it's not that they're bad, and it's no disrespect, but there is just a certain level, especially with the brass and the horns, and these people do so many sessions together. They've worked on so many films. They know how to blend. They know how to create that sound. So, for me, my favorite places to work are either at Fox or at Sony, sometimes at Warner Brothers, and then Abbey Road. I love Abbey Road, and I like Air Studios a lot. I like to do separate sections at Air Studios. There are guys that get better results at recording full orchestras. It's a very small stage at Air Studios. It's hard to put strings, brass, and winds out there at the same time. So I haven't had, with loud music, I haven't had those results. If I was doing a quiet score with, maybe a Desplat style score, then you could do something like that. But I love Abbey Road. I love Sony, and I feel like almost like an embarrassment of riches when I go into Abbey Road. Like, you almost can't record it bad. You can try almost anything and it's going to work. Now Galaxy, I love that studio at Galaxy. We did choir at that studio, Robin, and I thought the sound was fantastic there. I would love to go there. And I heard all the George Massenburg percussion recordings he did there, and everything. I think that's a fantastic studio, and Belgium, what was it, was it a radio studio we worked at in Brussels?
Yeah, Flagey.
Right, we were at Flagey. Also a very nice space and a lot of great players, but there is a difference in the depth of playing that you can get out of them rhythmically and, performance-wise, tuning-wise, and stuff like that. Having said that, I've gotten a lot of great recordings from there. I've gotten a lot of great recordings from Australia, from Trackdown. I've gotten great recordings from Nashville. I spent some time in Bratislava. I did my own library in Bratislava, and that was good. So, for doing large-scale instrumental recording, there's a lot of options. It's just, given, if it was my money and I had the resources to do it, I would probably pick LA or London.
Thank you.
Awesome. Let's go to a question. Harmoko is asking, what is the most challenging project, and if you can share like some of the process.
Hi, Harmoko. Challenging is a strange word because there's technically challenging, there's spiritually challenging, there's all those things. I would say the most technically challenging project I had to work on are in general the Chris Nolan movies, just because of his method of working and that whole process of having to match the mock-up with the live recordings and having to figure out how to get all that to work. It's just a really lot of data to have to input, and constantly having to match that ref is just it uses a different part of my brain, which is less creative and more logistical, and it's hard to stay creative. So I get pulled out of that quite a bit on that. There are other projects that are challenging for me simply because musically, either I have a hard time resonating with it, or they hit me in a certain way viscerally where I have a reaction to it. And then, I'm a pretty emotional guy. I wear my heart on my sleeve a lot. And so music affects me. And there's been projects I've worked on where it's just been hard for me to get through it, because it was hard for me to get through a scene without crying, and without feeling it. And so I've been challenged in that way. A lot of projects, especially that are done, where a lot of the mock-up is being used and it's being combined with a lot of live recordings. There's an American expression, hammering a square peg into a round hole, where the shape of things don't necessarily organically go together, and you have to spend a lot of time figuring out ways to make things work together. I've had films that were difficult in that sense because of the nature of the music and the process. And a lot of times what happens with these films is a composer presents a piece of music, and then they ask for changes, and then there are changes and changes on changes, and you get 11, 12 layers down of changes, and a lot of that original material doesn't really relate anymore to the stuff that's being changed, and somehow as a mixer, I have to get all that to work together. Pirates at times was like that. 6 movies in, for the obvious reasons, is we had these motifs and these themes that had to go from one movie to the next, to the next, to the next. And then all the other stuff was getting added to it. so I was the slave of both worlds. I had to figure out how to get all that organic stuff from Pirates One and those great Hans themes with all of the new stuff for all the new characters and everything to work together. So, it's fun when the challenging stuff is kind of fun, but every now and then you get a score where you just literally put up the faders and you go, I'm done. And that can happen because it was an all live recording, but even with pre-production and stuff, a lot of the people are going to not believe when I tell them this, but John Powell and Harry Gregson Williams, John really slaves over his stuff, and his stuff is complicated, and he spends a lot of time smacking a square peg into a round hole. But by the time it comes to me, it's magnificent. And then all I have to do is spend a lot of time making sure that orchestra fits timing wise and tuning wise and everything to all of his worlds. And once I do that, honestly, to me, it mixes itself. And the same thing with Harry. There's a lot of production, but he's already done all the work and scope and carving the frequencies and the imaging and stuff like that. All I really do with him is make stereo into surround and record the live stuff, and I'm set. So, didn't answer your question, but
that's great. So, yeah, great. Emmy, do you have any more questions?
I do, but maybe you don't. You want to go first? How do you? Because I in the last 20 years or 30 years or what have you, the way that composers and the relationship between composition, production, mixing, it's kind of now more mixed up, if that makes sense.
Right.
And for the people that I started my career with, that now they are now composers and we were all assistants. I have a feeling that now the lines between, okay, you do more composition, I do more like arranging, programming, mixing. How do you see like the next batch of composers are gonna work within a team, or composers now are getting more worded and wise with technology? So maybe a mixer is more a guy that oversees the whole, as well, even mostly musically, or like, do you see that as well in new composers? And how, for example, if you're working with your assistant, do you see that their workflow and their way of working and seeing or looking at things is totally different from what you do, or it's a constant morphing target?
Yeah, it's a morphing target. That's exactly right. There are composers now who have perfectly good mix rooms as their composer suites, and engineers go in there all the time and do their mixes right in the composer space. I've been doing that with Hans for years. Hans would work on something and he'd call me in. He'd say, "Hey, could you sit in my chair and just tweak this?" And so I would do that for him, and then he would he would go from there, and so we've been doing that for a while. And interesting question about my assistants, because you're right. As younger people who have been coming up in the more, in the computer generated world, they have a different perspective than I do, and so like Eva, my main assistant now, she, not only, is she a good assistant, but she offers me another way to look at things at times that is very, very valuable for me. It's not necessarily always what I'm going to need or want, but I never want her not to do it, because every now and then, and it's always that way. All of my assistants through the years have always come up with Kevin, who's my Pro Tools operator now for the last 20 years, was my assistant 25 years ago. And our whole workflow of the way we record and how we playlist and how we organize our orchestral recordings is really his brainchild. And, we've gotten so slick with it now, it's ridiculous. People are amazed at how fast, and it's not just us. Chris Barrett at Air Studios is also a ninja, and all these guys, but a lot of these young guys are really, come with tremendous amounts of skills, and if they're coming from songwriting, like I had an assistant, Forrest, who was he was more of a composer than a mixer. So he would, I would have him on a thing, and I'd be doing something, and I need a line, and I'd say to Forrest, "Can you put a bass line in?" And so I can't do that. I don't have that skill set. So yeah, I just think that now it's becoming a big glob of knowledge, and
Yeah.
although I come from a traditional sense, the thing I try to do is constantly stay aware of the world as it's turning, and it's my way of uh, uh,
Yeah.
of idiot proofing myself, or keeping myself from becoming obsolete is to stay in it. Plus I enjoy it very much. A lot of it is the technology that's happening today. The depth of technology is amazing now, and we now, of course, we can collaborate from different locations and work on the same piece of music at the same time, and it's really an amazing time for music making.
Yeah,
the amazing. Totally, yeah, go ahead. I'm sorry.
No, I totally agree.
I totally agree. That's right. Yeah, I think that is one of the things I like to point out is we all now have the same tools. I might have more EQs than you do, but no matter who you are, you can do everything I can do with an EQ. You can do everything I can do with a compressor. You can do everything I can do with a processor or a saturator or a reverb or a delay or a sound or to edit or anything. So we're sort of out of the era of I have better toys than you. That isn't, back in the day, if I had a better studio, if I had a better, set of microphones and stuff, now, even with microphones, it's like, you could, for $300, you could buy a large cap condenser that, you'd have to be a pretty serious nerd to hear the difference between that and my U67s. So it really comes down to, creative choices and thought, and how it's like, and I'm aware that the world is catching up with, that has caught up with me and passed me technically. So it's what can I offer my clients? What service am I offering now with who I am now? Well, I have my experience, which is very, 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 very valuable, but I also have the ability to forward look, and to see where I could take all this experience and see how it can affect things, looking forward to like I'm working on a project now that is asking me to be able to create a certain sound that isn't something that you're going to be able to do with an EQ or a compressor or a delay or even a reverb. And I've been spending a lot of time thinking about that. And as Einstein said, thought experiments. And believe me, I'm no Einstein, but I think I've come up with a solution. I've experimented with it now, and it seems to be working. Something I can offer, as a new approach to how to mix in a funny way, and it's not really a new approach. It's just using tools that have been there in a different way. It's repurposing tools in a different way.
Really good. Okay.
Made me really curious now.
I wish I could tell you.
All right.
It's simpler in what it's going to be. The process of getting there is going to be much more involved, but the end result, if I do my job right, won't seem like it.
Okay. And is there any project that we can listen or see that on? Is that going to be released?
Yes, I can. I just can't tell you what it is. But
okay.
But the thing is, so what's happening now in 2020, in the middle of this pandemic and this quarantine, is there's a lot of time and energy has to be put into how to make these separate, disparate recordings sound like a unified piece of music. There's a lot of people doing a lot of interesting stuff. A lot of this falls back to stuff I've been doing for 20 years with people recording in their houses, like Tina Guo and Martin Tillman and, M.B. Gordy and all these great musicians. But now, because of what's going on, it's become a bigger thing, and so a lot of our time and energy as engineers now, and you can listen to, Jake Jackson just did this beautiful thing. You can hear it on YouTube where they did the BBC orchestra. He did a piece of music with the BBC orchestra and had 90 pieces live. I thought he did a fantastic job. Jake, if you hear this, I'm telling you, man, props on you for that. And so this is forcing people's hands a little bit, and we're having to come up with new ways of doing old stuff, you know. So you know, that's part of what I'm explaining is because I can't put 50 players in a room, you know. I just can't do it right now. And even if I could, I wouldn't, because I don't think this thing is done. And a lot of my friends are my age and older, and I wouldn't want to put them at risk.
Mm-hmm. True that. Okay. Well,
sorry. Yeah, no. Did you have one more question? Or?
no.
Okay.
Because I think we're about an hour mark. So
Yeah.
good.
But yeah, Alan, thanks so much for your time. I think these are definitely challenging times. Like when you say with orchestras of how is the future of orchestral recording gonna look like. That's very interesting to think about. But thank you so much for taking the time and talking with us, and for also using our plugins.
I lost you on that, but
oh, sorry.
Well, let me talk about orchestral recording for a second, and then I want to talk about your plugins for a second.
Great.
Okay. You know, I hope to God and I believe that orchestral recording is gonna be alive and well for a long, long time. I think that something that happens in that experience that can't be recreated any other way, although you can get close, and then there's certainly projects where the differences aren't that important. There's always going to be the need for that sort of ensemble in a room, creating that environment, hopefully in the world of film music, you know, and I believe it will. Now, as for the Leapwing products, the only thing you're doing wrong is you should be making more plugins, because the quality of the plugins you're making is world class. You know, I can tell you that I have been doing mono to stereo techniques for a long, long time, you know, using delays and using frequency-based delays and creating my own environments, and other companies have these things. But, you know, the stage one has its own way of doing it. And I have found that for what I'm looking for, that is my first go-to. It's incredibly effective. It's incredibly uncolored. And it does exactly what you need it to do when you need to create with, and does it in a way that is downward compatible with no problems at all. And so that now the Dyne 3 is, it's a new way to look at something that people have been doing for a long time. And this is not a plugin that I consider uncolored. I think it's got a unique signature. And once you get into it, you start playing with it. The thing I've discovered with it is, you know, I could make things as drastic, Junkie XL level drastic with the percussion and stuff like that. But I can also treat it as a subtle, you know, device that literally just adds an almost imperceptible amount of width and warmth to things, and I find it very effective. And then the other one, the the MS one, I can't remember the name.
Center one.
Right, the Center one is just an incredibly solid tool. You know, I use it all the time when I need to do just that. I need more of the center stuff. I need less of the center stuff, and it just does it. It does it in a low latency kind of way, and it just works really well. But you know, you guys are making great stuff, and you know, Robin, you reached out to me a while back and said, give this a try. And I said, all right, I'll give it a try. I get a lot of plugins. And I immediately, like, I think the next day just got back in touch with you and said, this stuff is really great. And you know, I don't really hawk a lot of plugins, but there are a few small companies that are out there now doing really amazing stuff that is, in my opinion, next level stuff, and you guys are at the top of that list.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
That means a lot.
Not lying, I'm telling you the truth, though.
Very cool.
Great.
Thank you.
Well, we're definitely working hard to create more things, so it's
there's more on the way. Definitely.
Well, let's talk because I have ideas. You know, if you want me to throw my 2 cents in, I'd be glad.
Great. Awesome.
Sure.
We will be in touch for sure. Great.
We will do that.
All right. Well, thanks again for the
Is
time.
that it? Are we done?
I think so. We're a bit over time already.
Oh, my
so
pleasure.
it's, yeah. Thank you
All right.
so
Well, everyone out there, keep working, stay safe.
Thank you, Alan.
Make sure that, you know, wear a mask, wash your hands,
much. Yeah.
and I'll see you next time.
Perfect.
Thank you so much.
Adios.
Thank you all.
Bye.
Bye.
All right.